Hey everyone, so this is Unit 2, Lesson 4, and today's lesson is going to focus on the changes people made to the land within Mesopotamia. So in the last lesson you learned about the overall geography of Mesopotamia and the different things that it had to offer the people who settled there. Today's focus is going to look at the changes that the people made to their environment, so to the land, and we're going to look at both the good changes and the bad changes. So we're going to start with the helpful and good changes. As you previously learned, one of the biggest challenges that people faced during this time and in this area was the uncontrolled water supply. So during the spring, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers would flood across the plains. And while they knew it would happen during the spring season, they really didn't know when exactly it was going to flood. So sometimes they would already have crops growing or would have just started planting their crops and planting the seeds. And when the floods would happen, it would destroy whatever was already planted. So this was a major problem. And then the rest of the year, they faced the problem that the land was really dry. This area is a very hot and dry climate. It's very semi-arid, so it's very warm, very kind of desert-like. But so aside from having floods during one part of the year, the rest of the year was really kind of dry. So the people struggled to raise their crops because they either had too little water or too much. And they needed a way to control the water so that they had reliable water supply all year round. In order to successfully grow their food, they needed to do something. But what could they do? Well, they created something called irrigation systems to provide water for their fields. Irrigation systems are just systems that are created to control the amount of water that is given to an area. So this is usually done in farmland or within fields for crops and things. And the irrigation systems that they created had three parts. They had levees, canals, and dams. And we're going to learn about all three. So they ended up building levees along the sides of the river to prevent flooding. So levees are walls that are built to prevent a river from flooding its banks. They used mud or other earth materials. We actually have levees now. We still use them. So we got this technology from them thousands and thousands of years ago. But these are just walls built along the banks of the river in order to prevent it from flooding over the side. So that was really helpful because it kind of controlled the flooding. And then also they could poke holes or build holes into the levees and let water go into the fields when it was dry and when they needed it. So they kind of got to control when the water left the riverbanks. And another part of this is that they dug canals, and canals are just pathways that are dug through certain areas, and in this case, dug through the fields, that would take the water through the fields where they wanted it to. So they would poke the holes in the levees, let water out, and then the water would go through the canals into the fields exactly where they wanted instead of just flooding the whole area. So they also constructed dams along the river. And these dams would block the water in certain areas. So we have them in present day. So this top picture is a modern one, but it shows you how that works. They would build these walls up and it would reroute the water to where they wanted it. So the river would then flow to a certain area, and oftentimes it would flow into pools or some kind of holding container or reservoir that they built, and then they could get it later. So it would store that water for future use, whether it was still during kind of the rainy season or the flood season or throughout the year when it was super dry. They knew that they had water stored away in these pools that they could get later for future use. So they ultimately changed the land in a good way with irrigation systems. It changed how the water flow, and it brought the water to other areas that it previously didn't go to. It changed the dryness of the area, so it let the land have more water, let the crops have more water, both native plants and crops they were growing. And it increased water access during the dry season so they could have that water whenever they needed it. So another invention that they created that changed the land was the plow. And a plow is a tool for tilling or turning the soil to help prepare it for planting. And the soil, like we said, this is a dry area, so unless it was like a rainy season or during the flood season, the soil is going to be pretty dry. So it's going to be hard to actually dig up the soil to plant the seeds in order to grow the crops. So the plow kind of helped them really do this a whole lot easier. So it was first made of wood, and it has a curved or bent edge that cuts the ground and turns the soil. So it's pointy and sharp at the end, and it would go into the ground and bring that rich soil that's underneath the dry top layer up to the top. And it would also leave easier access for them to go behind and plant seeds. So they could be pushed or pulled either by people or animals, but this really helped them change the land because it made the surfaces more plantable, and it changed the overall structure of the ground because it was bringing that good rich soil that was underneath that dry top layer to the surface. So all of these changes were great and really helped the people out, but they're also going to bring some not so great changes. So one of the things is they ended up overworking the land. So they would overfarm an area, and they would do this because they would end up planting the crops in the same area year after year after year. And when this happens, the crops end up taking all of the nutrients out of the soil. So eventually that ground becomes unable to grow anything else. So they would end up over farming, and these areas would not be able to grow crops anymore. And they also had some problems with over irrigation. So irrigation really helped, but over irrigation ended up kind of ruining the land and possibly poisoning the crops. And this was done by just overwatering certain areas, but also leaving salt deposits on the soil. So when irrigation water evaporates, it leaves behind mineral salt, and the salt on the soil like this ends up killing the crops. So they would end up inadvertently killing the crops through their irrigation system. And also, they cause soil erosion. So when the irrigation water was going through areas or draining, so when the irrigation waters will go through, they would end up kind of washing through the areas. And while ultimately that sounds great, the problem is it would take away the soil that was needed to hold the roots in place. So when the soil gets washed away, this is what's known as soil erosion. So the soil would end up being washed away from areas that they really needed it to stay. And when there's no soil in place, the problem is that there's nothing for roots to hold on to. So crops, both ones that they planted and the native plants that they needed to stay in the area, would end up washing away as well. So we have lots of changes to the land, and we have the positive ones where irrigation brought water to previously dry areas and allowed water to be accessed throughout the entire year. And then we have the plow that changed the physical surface of the land to let things be grown more and easier. And then we have our negative changes. So overworking and overfarming the land took soil or the nutrients out of the soil, which led to areas not being able to grow crops. And then we had problems with over irrigation, where salt deposits left salt on the soil and killed crops, and soil erosion ended up washing away the crops.